Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Avorion, episode 72. I'm Enigmius, and today we're continuing with the Catapult Battleship build. We left off the last episode with this sort of weird kind of hole in the hull that it wasn't created by anything. It was just something that we hadn't completed yet, and I loaded up the game, and I had a couple of different things that I had on my mind that I wanted to take care of. But as soon as I saw this section that was incomplete, I decided that I would be much happier in the long run if I just took care of it, got it sorted out, and then we can move on to the rest of the build and not feel like there's this gaping hole in the hull that we have to take care of. Yes, that's the easiest way to describe it. The shape that we have here, where we've got like all kinds of different sections of the hull going in different directions and they don't line up with one another, came about as a result of just kind of building out what we had on the back end of this section, the way that the blocks wanted to fit. There was no specific plan that I had in mind to create this particular shape, and I just started working on it and building it out, and it turned into this. There were two options. I could have dismantled a fair bit of it and tried to make it come together in sort of a more uniform fashion. But at the same time, looking at it and the way that bottom section didn't line up with the bottom section that we had already finished, kind of created an opportunity for an interesting sort of feature to the hull. I've talked about having like these openings, like these air scoops, but obviously for space air and not atmospheric air, and how I like them done in a certain way, and hopefully not overdone. But it's a feature in a lot of my builds because I like the way that it looks. And this was another one of those situations where we could add something like that and take advantage of this accidental shape that we ended up with as a result of just trying to build this thing so that it was a little bit wider and a little bit beefier on the front end. And you can see now we're still very much working with the shapes that we're given as we transition from one layer to the next, and kind of see how things come together. This is, for me, a really great way to learn, because I find when I stop and I try and spend a lot of time figuring out how to control a specific outcome, either I'm successful, but it relies on skills that I've already developed, ways of looking at things that I've already established, or I'm not successful, in which case it's frustrating because my goal wasn't to create something that I was happy with. It was to create something specific and to control the outcome. And it's sometimes a great learning opportunity when we take something like this and just kind of let it do what it wants to do, and then see what we can do to shape it in a particular way and sort of a bit of a direction that we can be happy with, without necessarily trying to create a very specific outcome. And that's a really fun way to do things in a creative setting like this, where we don't have to do anything a certain way. There's no instruction manual that comes with the build for this particular ship that says it has to be a certain way, otherwise nothing else is going to work. We just do whatever the hell we want, and when we get to the end, if we like it, we keep it. If we don't like it, we take it apart and we do it again. It's like Lego ever since I was a kid, and that was we had Lego in buckets. It was never organized. It was just buckets of Lego. Some of it was probably 20 years old, like hand-me-down Lego, and you just dump it out on the floor and you start building stuff. I think that's probably a pretty good way of doing things sometimes. And games like this, the best part about it is when you're done, you don't have to clean up all the Lego and put it back in the bucket. You just exit the game and you're done. So we've got round 2 of this particular profile is sort of coming together. We've got it kind of taking shape, but now we've got this situation where we've got most of that rear section that was incomplete complete, And we're trying to make it line up with that front section and all of the different ways that it's supposed to, in order for it to look like it's one unified design and not something that we sort of slapped together and abandoned because we didn't really want to get it to work the way that we had in mind, just from the standpoint of the standards that we have, and looking at it and saying, that's okay, I'm happy with that, I like the way it looks, or there's parts about that I don't like for specific reasons, so we're going to redo it. And in this case, a big part of that whole thing, reasons that we wanted to redo it, is because we had to get a certain element lined up with the pre-existing part of the hull. And you can see now we're kind of wrapping it around, and it reminds me of like a World War I German helmet, the way that this shape is coming together. It's got that sort of ridge around it. I as soon as I recognized that, that's the first thing that it made me think of, was that sort of weird ridge around the helmet. We're not going to keep that the way that it is. I don't want it that similar. I wanted something so that it lined up with the part that we just added and the part that was existing before we loaded up the game for this particular episode. So we've got that top section now. As it wraps around, it lines up just fine, and we just have to take a couple of minutes to readjust so that it doesn't have that specific profile that was bothering me. And it doesn't take a whole lot. In this case, it's a fairly simple profile that we're wanting to line things up with. We just have to kind of give a little bit of thought to some of the transitions. Like here, I spent a little bit of time looking at that specific transition, and now wrapping it around is going to be a very, very simple and straightforward process, so that we get everything is lining up. There's obviously a visible seam in this section that we just put in, because we've got blocks that are coming together and they're sort of working in completely opposite directions to one another. But it doesn't stand out as an ugly seam that was left because we couldn't bother to try and figure out how that we could make it work a little bit better. Ultimately, I can live with this. I can't imagine at this point going back and saying, you know, we're going to start over, we're going to scrap this thing and we're going to try and make it all smooth in a certain way. I don't think it's necessary. Like I said, the nice thing about this is we're looking for similarities with the ship that we built prior to this, because they're going to be working in the same fleet, but that doesn't mean that they have to be the same. And you can see we've got that sort of open section now on the underside of this hull, and we're just kind of patching things up, making sure things line up the way that we want them to. And overall, the primary concern that I had was that I wasn't going to be able to make this section work in a way that I would be happy with, and that I would have to spend a lot of time reworking it so that everything lined up sort of more in the uniform fashion based on everything that we had set up in the previous episode. I wanted things to kind of stand out a little bit this time around, and I think they do. It's got some interesting lines to it. One of the things that I'm considering for this ship in particular is how much flat space that we have on the hull for mounting turrets. And that's very, very important on a battleship, that we have room for lots and lots of turrets. As many turrets as we can possibly slam onto the thing is kind of what we want to make sure that we're set up to accommodate. So in this case, flat space is our friend. But the whole design up to this point, the previous ship and this one as well, there's a certain amount of flat space, but it's all also curving in a variety of different directions. So there's a point where I have to kind of stop and consider whether or not I'm undermining the ability of the ship to do what it needs to do by including all of these different curves. Because once we've got the entire hull assembled, then we have to kind of look at things in terms of, if we place a turret here, for example, in a place, whatever place you happen to have in mind, is it going to be able to hit everything in a wide arc based on its location, or is it going to have a bunch of stuff in the way that's preventing it from doing that? There's no such thing as a turret that can hit everything in a 360-degree, three-axis sort of rotation. It just doesn't work that way. But we want to try and make sure that we're creating enough space where we can mount turrets in a way that they're effective from as many different angles as possible, so that we can get as many turrets active on a target at the same time, etc., etc. These weird considerations that we have when it comes to the performance side of things. So when it's all said and done, we've got basically a little bit of flat space on the side here. We can mount turrets, or we can just use it for aesthetic detailing once we kind of get a feel for how everything else is going to line up. We've got this section here. We just kind of reworked it for a slightly softer curve. I found it was a little bit too harsh, and it didn't really fit based on that initial iteration, but we've softened it a little bit so that it's a little bit closer to the hull and follows the main form of the hull, and does so in a way that's kind of visible. It's got some aggressive lines to it. It makes the ship look a little bit meaner, but it's not standing out as a major feature of the ship that is going to be distracting. And that's kind of also key for a lot of these designs, is you can get away with a lot of things that don't look especially good as long as they don't draw attention to themselves too much. And that's kind of a key thing that it pays to kind of consider. There's a time and place to take the occasional shortcut, and other times when you kind of have to stick it out and do it right. The less attention something draws to itself, the more likely you're going to be able to get away with a bit of a shortcut, if that's necessary in order for you to be able to move on with the build and not worry about too much of the outcome. And just like we did with that curve from the front profile, reworking it a bit so that it's a little bit softer. Here, we're just kind of doing the same thing. We're working this curve so that it's a little bit more uniform as it comes down and towards the front of the ship. And this is a little bit tricky because we can't line it up with a lot of the existing blocks. We have to actually create segments and look at things in terms of lines and how we're using the different blocks to contribute to those lines. And eventually, if we're fortunate, it comes together. But in this case, it's going to be a little bit sticky. You can see it's not wanting to go together necessarily the way that I had in mind, but we just work it and rework it, and we end up with something that ultimately I'm pretty happy with. So now that we've basically got this front section of the ship taken care of, I'm satisfied with it, at least for the time being. We can move on and we can start working our way back. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next episode. We're going to be focusing on that center section of the ship, where there's going to be sort of like a cavity in the center of the ship where there's going to be nothing there, but there's going to be some things wrapped around it, which will hopefully be functional and interesting, depending on what specifically it is we're trying to accomplish. And then we can sort of take a look at what we've got between the front and the center section and decide exactly what we want to do with the back end, which I think might actually be probably the most plain part of the entire ship, but we'll see. I don't want to give away too much before we get there. So if you want to be notified about the next and future episodes in this and other series, as always, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.